This is Research Like a Pro, episode 198, Identifying John Wilson, Part 1, DNA Evidence. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogist professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the authors of Research Like a Pro, a genealogist guide. With Robin Worthland, they also co-authored the companion volume, Research Like a Pro with DNA. Join Diana and Nicole as they discuss how to stay organized, make progress in their research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go! Hi, everybody. Welcome to Research Like a Pro. Hi, Diana.
Hi, Nicole. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I should call you Mom. I know some people wonder why I call you Diana. I want people to know your name.
That's right. And it's okay. I know what you mean.
I do always usually call her Mom. So, what have you been doing and working on?
Oh, my goodness. So many different things. I've been reading, though, such a fun book. I think I talked about this maybe last week. I don't know. I'm going to talk about it again today because I'm just loving it. It's Martha Hoffman Rising's book on breaking your brick walls down, the family tree problem solver. But it's been so fun. I just went through the 10 biggest mistakes that genealogists make, and I totally saw myself and others in each one of those, and it was fun. She gives great case studies and good examples. So I'm really enjoying that. It's always fun to learn from other experts. So I would recommend that book to anyone who wants something new.
I'm guessing one of the common mistakes was combining two people of the same name, and I know I've done that before in the past. All right, so for announcements, we just wanted to let you know that we'll be at NGS, the National Genealogical Society conference coming up in May. So if you want to come and stop by the exhibit hall, we'll be there at the Family Locket booth. So we hope to see you there.
Great. It'll be so fun to see people in person again.
And we're excited to have our guest here today. We're welcoming Rick Wilson to the show.
Hi, Nicole and Diana. Thank you so much for having me on today.
Hi, Rick.
Thanks for coming. We're really happy to have you here to talk about your Wilson research. And just by way of introduction, Rick joined us at our Research Like a Pro study group, number 7, and he is a skilled researcher and writer. After working with him, we were very impressed, and he's sharing his research today to identify John Wilson's origins using some DNA evidence and historical context, so it's really fun. Rick has been researching his family for 30 plus years, and he's worked with Y-DNA since 2006 and autosomal DNA since 2011. And he actually also has a blog and a website. It's called myfamilypattern.com. And professionally, Rick teaches marketing at Texas State University. So, Rick, before we jump into talking about the Wilsons, tell us how you got started in genealogy research.
Well, I started at a relatively young age. I was living in DC for a period of time, and I knew the National Archives were there, and I've always been fascinated with my own personal history. And I immediately went to the archives looking for an ancestor whose name I didn't even know, but yet I wanted to find evidence that an ancestor had served in the Civil War. Um, I was quickly disappointed in the fact that I couldn't find anything, but I was invigorated to learn something more about my family. And my father quickly sent me an obituary for his grandfather, which really just set me down the path of investigating my family and kind of developing my own process for how to do research, which, to be honest, fits very well with Research Like a Pro.
Wow. It's so fun to hear everybody's backstory. And there's always that little hook, isn't there? Something that gets us wanting to research.
Yes, yes.
Well, let's talk about the Wilsons now. So, tell us about your research problem.
Well, I was investigating my 6 times great grandfather, John Wilson, who was born about 1716 and died in 1799 in Pennsylvania. And I think, like many of us, we all have a favorite ancestor. And for me, I've always over-identified with any ancestor carrying my current surname. And I wanted to know where in Europe he was likely from. With a name like Wilson, he could be from Ireland, Northern Ireland, Scotland, England, and even parts of Scandinavia. So I had no idea where he was from, but I really wanted to investigate it. And so that was the purpose of my research.
Wilson is a common surname, and so I'm not surprised at all that that was a big challenge. And researching that far back in time, that's a big obstacle as well, with not as many records. So,
It was very much a challenge, and I've always been frustrated with the Wilson surname because they, at least at that point in time, seemed to be really prolific. So it was difficult to always match up, my surname and the forename of my ancestor to any other records. But I will have to say, after participating in the Research Like a Pro study group, the structure that you guys provided really gave me the confidence to tackle this research problem and really organize it in a way that really helped me convey the information I was looking to do.
It's interesting you say that, the idea of the structure. I think it's doing just one little piece at a time. You have this assignment, dive in and do your best on that, rather than just sitting down and trying to solve it in one session. Don't you think that makes a huge difference?
I really agree because, I mean, I know you've read my report and it's not necessarily a simple report. There's a lot of moving pieces in it, but that structure gave me, the confidence to kind of put it together and tackle one piece at a time and then synthesize it in a way that hopefully, makes sense to readers.
Yeah, it's just an amazing thing when you break it up into little pieces. Well, let's go through your research strategy. I mean, how did you solve this challenge of a common name so far back?
Well, I tried to tackle this from many different directions. I really utilized DNA quite heavily. I used Y-DNA because that is one of the areas that, I mean, it makes sense if I'm tracking the origin of, my ancestor's surname. So Y-DNA really kind of helped me focus on that. And that has more deeper roots that can take you back further in time. I also used autosomal DNA in part because that would allow me to also then look more recent with matches, hopefully kind of triangulating those two. And then once I felt like I would have a better direction of where I would be looking, where the DNA matches are pointing me to, I then looked to documentary evidence as my kind of my third pillar of trying to understand, where my ancestor was from. And then finally, and I know both of you talk about, research context a lot, and I couldn't agree more that was an important part to really understanding not only the story of my ancestor, but making sure I was interpreting records correctly based off of, what was happening in the time periods where my ancestor was likely immigrating, and for those DNA matches I had when they were immigrating and living either in Ireland or here in America.
That was such a great explanation. I want to respond to a couple things, especially I know we'll talk more about the Y-DNA, but just at the front of this, so many people take that Y-DNA test in hopes that it's going to just give them their ancestor. And it doesn't work like that most of the time. In fact, I don't think I've ever had a case where that actually worked. You have to combine it with autosomal. And I love that you really talked about the documentary and the historical context, because I'm sure there were a few people of the same name, John Wilson's, and that historical context that helps you say, okay, mine is this one and this is the other guy over here. So I love how you put that all together.
Thank you. It was certainly a challenge to kind of sort out the John Wilsons and then, frankly, all of the Wilsons that were in the area where my ancestor lived. And so that really did kind of help me separate them, especially when we think of the different origins where Wilson can come from. The historical context helped me to kind of separate them. And so I did find that very useful. And the Y-DNA, you're right, it won't pinpoint this is my ancestor, but it does help separate Wilson lines into well-defined groups. So I could easily kind of eliminate others and include others to further research.
Oh, that is a great explanation. And of course, that takes a little bit of knowledge about how to use Y-DNA. So I'm glad you're going to share some more of that with us. But before we get to that, tell us just a little bit more about John Wilson. Put him in some historical context for us.
Absolutely. So John Wilson was likely born around 1716 And he first shows up in any records in the US in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, which is just outside of Philadelphia. He advertises in 1747 that his horse has run away or been stolen and puts out a 20 shilling reward in the Philadelphia newspaper at the time. And so that was his first mention. What was key about that is that he says where he was living. He was living in Solebury Township, Bucks County, near Thomas Pryor's mill. And I was able to link him to that particular newspaper article because that was where his wife was living, probably like 1 mile from there. So I was able to kind of pinpoint that was him. And other than that, he married a Quaker woman about 1745 or 46. And the records track him moving from Solebury Township, Bucks County, to Franconia Township, Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, around 1752. And he lived in Franconia from that point onward until about 1799 when he died.
Wow, that's great. And I noticed that you were able to use some Quaker records, which are so great in that period, the 1700s. Those records can be kind of sparse. So that was providential that you had the Quaker records.
Yes, the Quakers records, I think, have been so helpful in my own research. If anybody is fortunate enough to have any Quaker ancestors, they often give you a route of where they moved from town to town, because they were required to, bring a letter with them, so to speak, to kind of say in their new community, we are upstanding citizens from the old community. Will you please accept me into your local community and church where we're moving to? And so easily able to track ancestors, as they moved at a point in time when records are very sparse.
That's great. And you also mentioned in your blog post that you used it to track his fan club, all the associates that were named in those records. And that helped to really put him in a family grouping as opposed to another person of the same name.
That is true. The Quaker marriage records are fantastic. If you ever see one, they basically, say somebody who's been married, and then they list everybody who's in attendance. And those that are listed in attendance are usually family and friends, and the family is listed often close to and oftentimes below the two individuals who are getting married. And usually the parents are actually listed directly below the two getting married. And it's just fantastic for providing that level of detail.
Oh, that's so awesome. Well, that gives us a good basis. So now we can dive into DNA.
Yes, let's do this. So, Rick, tell us, how did the Big Y DNA analysis help with this case? And if you wouldn't mind just explaining some of the terms that you're using as you go.
Absolutely. So, Big Y DNA is a Y DNA test that tests markers that are only passed down from father to son. So it's really a male type of test. And I use Family Tree DNA's most advanced test, which is they call the Big Y 700. And it's because they test 700 markers. And we're looking for patterns within those markers that can separate all males into a particular branch of the human family tree. And so I use this to basically figure out, okay, where does my John Wilson fit? And I tested my own Y DNA, and since I have an unbroken male line to John Wilson, and the results from this is you get a couple of different things from Family Tree DNA. One, it gives you your list of matches of those who have a Y DNA signature, if you will, meaning you have few mutations in your DNA suggesting that you are more closely knit. I had a total of 17 DNA matches that were really close to each other. And family tree DNA suggested that was probably about 300 to 400 years ago that the common ancestor for these 17 DNA matches were they kind of represented on the family tree. I really looked to kind of investigate these 7 closest matches. And what I ended up finding out is that nearly every single one of these 17 DNA matches were they had origins to County Fermanagh in Northern Ireland. And that really kind of helped me pinpoint, as a compass, so to speak, as to where to begin to look for my ancestral origins for John Wilson.
That's wonderful. So, can you tell us how close were they? Like, was there a genetic distance of 0, 1, 2?
They kind of varied, and at the big Y700 level, it can be quite dramatic in terms of their genetic distance and still be a close big Y match. But across them, the 17 group, they varied from about 5 genetic distances or different haplogroups. Haplogroups are really like a smaller branch of the Y DNA family tree. And so they differed from about, like, I would say, anywhere from 5 to those in my own branch, really only like a couple.
That's such a good explanation. And it's good to point out that it's different with the big Y matches versus like a Y37 test where there's only 37 markers, right? So you'd only expect to see a distance of 0, 1, 2, and 3, and 4 at 37. But when you test so many more markers, there's going to be more differences.
Yes, absolutely. And I think what is interesting is, and I won't claim to know everything about it, but what is really impressive, what family tree DNA provides, is what they call a block tree, which I kind of equate it to the large branches that come off of a trunk of a tree. And the block tree that they show is this branch that comes off of the trunk. If the trunk is every male in the planet, the big branch that comes in are those that are in my haplogroup, or I1A, which is the kind of where my Wilson group fits. And this larger branch is then broken up into smaller branches. And those smaller branches are where my DNA matches are. And we can map those to that larger branch. And family tree DNA can provide an estimate based off of, how many years ago that likely was. And I have to stress that it is an estimate. I mean, I feel that there's probably in as much art as there is science into kind of determining the number of years back in time that the connection lies.
Absolutely. I do like the block tree for that purpose of showing, maybe each of these blocks could represent a range of years, and then going back, seeing where you meet up with different branches and back to the trunk. One thing that I think a lot of people might get confused about are the different names of the haplogroup branches. And, some are really higher level and some are more specific. But even if they're different, that can still mean that you have a common haplogroup further back in time. You know what I mean?
Yes, that's exactly it. I mean, if genes keep mutating at a regular pace, they're going to create separate branches that follow certain generations down one line, but there is one point where they all meet and they don't have mutations further back in time. And that's what that block tree really shows. And it's a really good visual to kind of accompany what I think can be overwhelming, is looking at, okay, so we have this many mutations different. What does that mean? That block tree really helps, especially for those of us who are visual learners. It's great.
Right. So all of your matches were Wilsons except for a couple
Yeah,
toners.
exactly. I think a lot of people, when they get Y DNA tests back, they'll see many different surnames, and it's kind of hard to understand, okay, why would that be? Nearly all of the 17 were Wilsons, except for 4, which was Toner. I have a couple of research collaborators who've done really amazing work with the Wilsons back in County Fermanagh in Northern Ireland. And they really kind of help point me in a direction like, who is this Toner, and why are they in our Wilson group? And I was able to discover the actual birth and baptismal record for the Toner individual who is the ancestor for this group. And basically, what the baptismal record showed, is the birth record, sorry, was that the mother gave her surname to her son, who was Toner, and the father was not listed and was likely probably not unknown, but was probably out of wedlock, more than likely. And that's how that line developed.
How neat that you were able to find that and document that misattributed parentage or whatever you want to call that event where the man's surname isn't passed down. So often we see this in the YDNA results, but we have no idea when it occurred. So congratulations to you for finding that baptismal record and putting all that together. That's neat.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, and I love that you went to documentary evidence to figure that out, because we don't realize that those types of things are in the records. But I've seen lots of cases where court order books have to name the biological father because they want him to step up and provide some help for this woman, the bastardy bonds and illegitimacy. It can be right there in the records. And if you didn't know that, you wouldn't go looking for it. So it can help explain some of these things.
I agree. I think it's really important that you find your own path, but for me, what really works is you work with DNA, you follow those leads there, then you work with the documentary evidence, then you come back to your DNA and see if it kind of helps explain it better. So I really feel like it's kind of bouncing back to the both to kind of build your story.
I completely agree. Well, with that, let's shift gears and go to autosomal DNA, because I know the Y-DNA pointed you to the specific location in Northern Ireland, but now you turn to autosomal DNA to get a little bit closer. So tell us how that helped.
Well, that was really helpful for kind of taking what Y-DNA was, which was really that compass pointing me to, County Fermanagh in Northern Ireland. Obviously Y-DNA points you back a little further in time, and I wanted something that would allow me to pull a little bit closer to where we probably have more records available. And so I used autosomal DNA to look for DNA matches that potentially were connected to my Wilson line that also had origins in County Fermanagh. I used not my DNA, but I used another cousin of mine. She's a third cousin who I've been working with for upwards of 20 years. She has a closer connection to our common ancestor, John Wilson, than I do. There were longer generations in her particular line. So she is actually, John Wilson is her fourth great grandfather. And within that kind of that sweet spot of what autosomal DNA really helps us to identify, which is, potentially up to 8 generations backwards. So she allowed me to potentially access some DNA matches that I wouldn't have access to. I mean, the fact that she's got 2 more generations potentially gives her 75% more of the original DNA of our ancestors than I would have.
You're very fortunate to find a tester like that. Well, and it was someone you were working with. So, but for someone who maybe doesn't have a connection, that might be a little bit more difficult, but I think it's well worth seeking out someone who can take the test that is closer. I love that you gave us that number that she had potentially as much as 75% more DNA. That's pretty striking.
It is pretty impressive when you think about it. And I've worked with her DNA matches for upwards of 10 years, and I just see the patterns are so much richer with her DNA matches than they are with mine and some of my other cousins. So it really is valuable.
I just have to ask, Rick, did you ask any other testers to share with you, or did you just focus on yours and hers?
That is a very interesting question. I have, over the years, developed many different relationships with cousins to help identify some of my ancestors. The Wilson line has plagued me for a very long time, and it was only by me recruiting some of my cousins, and I focused on cousins that were like second and third cousins. So I wanted greater distance so we wouldn't have as many common ancestors together. And I recruited them to participate. And I've met a lot of other people online who's already tested with Ancestry or other places. And they've been very generous to share their list of matches with me. And I have probably access to upwards of 2 dozen people who have shared their DNA matches with me that really has helped to identify potential clusters of DNA matches for whichever line I'm working on. It's been really, really valuable.
That's fantastic. I think that's one of the keys to really finding out more about our ancestors that are further back in time. That whole concept of autosomal DNA coverage, where if we just use our own results, we maybe only get a tiny piece of the picture of that ancestor. But once we add in more and more and more descendants of those further back ancestors, then we can really find more and more clusters, like you said.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think the amount of success that I've had breaking through brick walls, I directly relate it to having access to a number of kits that are triangulating back to that common ancestor. And we all know we inherit DNA randomly from our parents. So it only makes sense logically that the more people we include in our scoping of potential ancestors, the more likely we are to find those clues.
All right, well, tell us how you worked with all these matches. How did you separate and filter them to find the relevant clusters?
That was an interesting process, and I'll admit that it took really several years to kind of hone in and truly identify these clusters. But the process that I use is something that I've kind of called the EGGS method, which is an acronym for earliest generation group of siblings search strategy, which is really to say that if I'm going after trying to identify John Wilson's parents or something beyond that, I'm going to focus in on the siblings of my ancestor who directly descended from John Wilson. So, his son, William Wilson, was my ancestor. So I look to his siblings and my DNA matches I have to them to look for shared matches that I have, or my cousin in this case, had with those siblings or through those sibling lines. The point being is that when I do that, I know that the matches that we share in common through those siblings should be related to the ancestral couple of John Wilson and his wife, Ann Skelton. So they should be there. Now, not 100%, but the likelihood is that that should be. So I use that kind of sibling search strategy to find those clusters. And in doing so, I actually didn't find any at that immediate generation of John Wilson's children. All of those DNA matches that I had in common there were through the Skelton line, which I was able to identify based off of those shared matches that I had with those cousins. So I went down one more generation to my William Wilson, who is the son of John Wilson, his children, and I looked through those matches that I had through the siblings of my ancestor through William Wilson. And it was there that I struck that gold. I found a couple of the siblings. If John Wilson is my oldest ancestor, William Wilson was his son. William's son, John, is my ancestor. And so I looked to John's other siblings to find those shared matches that could potentially help me identify that. And that's where I found them. And I had several strong matches that identified these clusters of matches who had County Fermanagh ancestral origins. And so I was like, they have to be either related through my William Wilson line that links up to John or through his wife, Phoebe Penrose. And so I had to basically do the legwork to find out whether it was on the Wilson side or the Penrose side. And that really comes down to, doing traditional genealogy of mapping out those family trees and finding those potential links between those matches and either my Wilson or the Penrose side at that point.
So it sounds like to separate out the Penrose matches, you were looking at family trees to separate them out. Did you have some Penrose matches as well that helped you filter the list?
I certainly did. I had a number of Penrose matches, and I compared the Penrose matches to the other shared matches that I was thinking that, okay, this is on my Wilson side, and they didn't cross, which suggested to me
Great.
that those were two distinct clusters.
And you mentioned in your article that you had used a Gefi network graph as well. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so when I was looking at the ancestry matches, these clusters that seemed to be on the Wilson side, I wanted to visualize them in another way. I mean, I could kind of see the pattern amongst my matches within ancestry. And I know, Nicole, you've done some great blog posts about using DNA GEDCOM and gefi to visualize your matches. So that is what I did. I downloaded my ancestry autosomal DNA matches using the DNA GEDCOM client, And what I did is there's obviously thousands of matches that are in there. But what I did is I took only those that were part of the cluster that I was seeing in Ancestry. So I filtered out everybody else and I just concentrated on those. Then I used gefi visualization software to show the network or the pattern of these matches. And thankfully, and not surprisingly, it really showed what I was seeing in those ancestry matches, but in a much clearer form. And I saw that there were two distinct clusters of DNA matches that appeared to be on my Wilson side.
That's fantastic, and I love that you were able to filter out the matches that you didn't want, in order to make your network graph more clear. I think that's a challenge for those of us who've tried Gephi.
It was a process, I'm not going to lie, but it was easy enough to do when you know the matches you're looking for. The DNA.gedcomp file can sort by those, and you can easily remove those and keep those that you want. So,
Yeah, I think everyone who's listening should go look at the blog post. It's called Identifying John Wilson's Irish Origins, Part 2, Autosomal DNA Analysis. And you can see a screenshot of the network graph here, and you can see the green cluster, which is the Pennsylvania cluster, and then the yellow cluster, which Rick identifies as the New Haven cluster.
As you've been talking, what is really coming to my mind is your familiarity with these matches. You have spent a considerable amount of time learning about these DNA matches and who they belong to, because if they are just names and you have no idea, nothing jumps out at you. But sounds like you spent years working with this DNA, and so you can finally come together. Is that right?
I partly laugh because, my family says sometimes I spend more time with dead people than I do with live people. But I'm a very analytical person, and I love to understand these patterns, and I do know their family trees. And to be honest, most of these matches, I've actually built their family tree for them, as
Yeah.
I know we all do.
Yeah.
So, yes, I do know them intricately, and I've spent years doing it, and it bears repeating. Your class gave me the confidence to take what I already knew in my head and organize it in a way that I hope readers can both digest and kind of appreciate.
Oh, yeah. Your article is so clear, and the visuals, it's just a joy to read through it and understand how you did this. So at this point, you are returning to documentary evidence and working on these clusters. You've got the Pennsylvania and the New Haven clusters nicely separated out, but then you have to find the common ancestor of each cluster. So, how did you approach that part?
As a preamble, the Pennsylvania cluster seems to be an earlier cluster in America, arriving in the 1700s, whereas the New Haven cluster was more recent immigrants in the 1800s. And so I was able to kind of separate them that way and help focus in some of my documentary evidence. But it was something that I discovered actually many years ago that didn't come into focus until I really started analyzing the data, is that one of these clusters, I found evidence in one of the county histories that said, and I'll actually read it. They were talking about one of the descendants that was actually featured in that county history. And they said that this individual, who was named Robert J. Wilson, who was born in 1845, this is what they said about his grandparents: John and Mary Burgess Wilson, natives of the Emerald Isle, but of Scotch descent. They were born in County Fermanagh, Ireland, immigrated to America shortly after the Revolutionary War, settling in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where they resided for several years. Thence, they removed to Mifflin County, Pennsylvania, where most of the children were born and raised. Subsequently, they moved to Ohio. It was this passage that really kind of helped me to kind of see that migration path, because I found these ancestors in Ohio. And then I started seeing the pattern amongst the other matches. This was the Pennsylvania cluster. I started to see Mifflin County, Pennsylvania showing up in some of these other matches. And as I researched them back further, I actually found another Wilson ancestor in that. It's like the pieces started to come together, and it was really that that key finding that really kind of helped focus that together.
Okay, I just have to make a comment looking at your blog post that the source of that great little piece that you read us was actually from a portrait and biographical album of Lynn County, Iowa. So that wasn't even in any of the locations mentioned.
Absolutely.
How'd you find that?
I'm not going to remember the correct term, but it's basically when you kind of build your tree for somebody else, not backwards, but forward in time. And it was following their descendants and building that tree out that allowed me to find that record to kind of link it back further in time.
Oh, that's great. And that's so important in DNA work, building the descendancy tree, looking at every clue in those descendants. So, what a great example.
Thank you.
So, you're starting to identify clusters. And I also had to mention that that was fun to read that they were natives of the Emerald Isles, so Ireland, but of Scotch descent. So, these were part of the Scotch Irish group that were there in Northern Ireland. And because of persecution at that time, wanted to come out to the new country. So, that's fun because, I've talked a lot about when I was reading the book on the Scotch Irish and their migration to Pennsylvania. So it's fun to see that play out in your family tree.
Absolutely. And that was a good clue that really helped my documentary research that comes later. So I have to laugh because as I was writing this report, I was listening to your podcast where you were actually talking about the book you were reading, which was, The Scotch Irish in America. And I immediately ran to the library and grabbed that book because it was valuable resource for me to kind of provide the historical context to, what comes next in this research project.
Oh, that's awesome. Isn't it a fun book? I mean, it was written so long ago, but I just found it pretty fascinating. It was fun.
It was great. I mean, to read about not only the reasons for the immigration or emigration, but also to understand their migratory paths within the US. It really corroborated a lot of the evidence that I found within my Pennsylvania cluster and my New Haven cluster.
That's great. Once again, bouncing back and forth.
Abs-
DNA, historical context, the documents. It just all works together.
For our last discussion today, let's talk next about some more DNA, bouncing back to that. So tell us, what segment data were you able to use in your research, and how did it help?
This was actually a very enlightening process. So once I knew my two different clusters that were focused on the Wilsons, I had to look at potentially did they all show up on the same DNA segment. And so we all know that Ancestry doesn't provide that level of detail, but we can download our raw DNA and upload it to other types of DNA software that can allow us to visualize that. So I uploaded my cousin's DNA to several different sources: GEDCOM, Family Tree DNA, and drawing a blank on the third. But when doing it, I was able to not only visualize where her matches were, then I found some of the matches that were in Ancestry were also in some of these sites. And there were enough of those Ancestry DNA matches to show up to really pinpoint the chromosome and the location in the chromosome where these DNA matches were found. And they really triangulated down to chromosome number 7. And it was where I found the Pennsylvania cluster was adjacent to this New Haven cluster. And they were right there on the DNA, and kind of straddling across both clusters were DNA matches descending from my John Wilson ancestor. So it was a really good visual to see how these clusters were next to each other and how my group of ancestors really kind of brought those two clusters together.
That's great. And it's wonderful that you could find matches that you already identified at Ancestry, at GEDmatch, and the other companies, because people are often in more than one database.
Yes, and thankfully people are consistent in, what they call their user ID in Ancestry is often similar to what they use in the other sites, or thankfully they also post their family tree, which also helps.
Right.
Did you use DNA Painter to paint those chromosomes?
I did not. I have used DNA Painter in the past, but for this one, I actually used, for my visual, I just used PowerPoint because I didn't want to get too complex, but I could show where these segments appeared on the chromosome 7 just as easily because I really didn't have that many to include.
Oh, interesting.
Once again, go and look at his blog post because there's a wonderful visual that he created in PowerPoint that shows the start and stop points on chromosome 7, and it's really nice.
Yeah, the visual is wonderful.
Thank you.
All right, before we end, at this point of the research with the Y-DNA and autosomal DNA analysis, what was your intermediate conclusion at this point?
At this point, I felt extremely confident that John Wilson's ancestral origins were in County Fermanagh in Northern Ireland, but I wasn't quite sure exactly where. I also, because of that wonderful county history, was believing that potentially his roots were beyond Northern Ireland, were probably in Scotland, and that his ancestors were part of the Ulster plantation of Northern Ireland, most likely from Scotland.
Well, you've found a lot of great things so far. So look forward to talking with you again next week about documentary research and historical context.
Thank you.
All right. Well, everyone, have a great week and go make some discoveries. We'll talk to you next time.
Bye. Thank you for listening. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your research. If you want to learn more, purchase our books, Research Like a Pro and Research Like a Pro with DNA on Amazon.com and other booksellers. You can also register for our online courses or study groups of the same names. Learn more at familylocket.com/services. To share your progress and ask questions, join our private Facebook group by sending us your book receipt or joining our courses. To get updates in your email inbox each Monday, subscribe to our newsletter at familylocket.com/newsletter. Please subscribe, rate, and review our podcast. We read each review and are so thankful for them. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.